It was a freezing cold winter night in January 1549, when a small group of armed men attempted to gain access to Hampton Court Palace. Their target was an 11-year-old boy, King Edward VI. The group was led by one of the king's two uncles, Thomas Seymour. Their shadows moved through the privy garden of the palace complex. Seymour's contacts with the royal valet John Falls and Edward's tutor Sir John Check had enabled the conspirators to overcome the first barrier of the security forces. Through these men, Seymour had obtained the second key to the garden. Edward's bodyguard formed 3 visible barricades around the king, traces of which are still visible today. The first barrier surrounded the entire palace complex. The guards were supposed to stop lost travelers, register incoming visitors, and investigate deliveries. As a member of Edward's Privy Council, Thomas Seymour would have been allowed to pass through this barrier. However, Seymour faced a problem. He would then have had to use the official route to the palace, which led directly to the second barrier. This was located in the courtyard of Hampton Court, where visitors were welcomed. Guards also monitored all entrances to the building. Although Seymour would theoretically have been allowed to pass through this barrier, he could not do so while armed. Without an explicit invitation, no one was permitted to enter the royal palace with weapons, not even the monarch's uncle. Therefore, Seymour and the 2 servants who accompanied him had to approach through the garden. Their assistants in the palace then smuggled them safely past the second barrier. The third and final barrier separated the royal apartments from the rest of the palace. Anyone wishing to enter had to pass through the guard's chamber. It is unclear how Seymour managed to get past this last barrier. The yeomen, founded by Henry Tudor before the Battle of Bosworth, had since protected the monarchs as bodyguards and were loyal to all Tudor rulers. Edward, fascinated by combat and the military, was no exception. It is easy to think that Seymour's aides supported him even at this stage. However, he must have separated from his companions, as he is the only one mentioned in further accounts. He may have previously scouted the royal security. In the preceding months, he had complained that Edward was poorly protected and that he could easily bring the monarch into his power with his own men. What Seymour didn't know in detail was the invisible security that surrounded Edward. Like all monarchs, Edward was constantly surrounded by servants who were supposed to protect him in case of emergency. There was no trace of these servants either. On his way to the royal bedchamber, Seymour must have been inwardly jubilant. Nothing seemed capable of stopping him from bringing his nephew into his power. How could it have come to this? Almost ironically, Seymour's nocturnal attack on the king had little to do with the 11-year-old monarch himself, and much more with his older brother, Edward Seymour. Edward had ascended to Lord Protector's position after Henry VIII's death, effectively leading the Privy Council and ruling de facto. This story also illustrates the significance of the boyking, but let's start from the beginning. Edward Seymour had also elevated himself to Duke of Somerset in his new role. In contrast, Thomas Seymour fell short of such honours. He was Marshal of the Royal Army and became Lord High Admiral of the English Navy. This role suited him, as he had previously distinguished himself several times in naval combat. He was also created the first Baron Seymour of Sudeley, but he felt humiliated by this title as it placed him significantly below his brother in the peerage. Thomas advocated for an early separation of the regency and guardianship of Edward, citing the arrangements made for Henry VI as an example. However, his brother consolidated both posts in his hands. Thomas's efforts to separate these roles were unsuccessful, leading him to openly oppose the Lord Protector on the political stage. Thomas abstained from his brother's campaign to Scotland, where Edward Seymour fought personally. Thomas also criticised the Lord Protector for carelessly relinquishing possession of the crown. Although he wasn't wrong, the beneficiaries of this measure were members of the Privy Council, who did not support his criticism. Seeking to connect with the young king, Thomas capitalised on Henry VIII's detailed regulations for Edward's minority, which lacked provisions for an allowance. The young king complained loudly that the Lord Protector was too stingy in this regard, and Thomas repeatedly helped out financially. In return, Edward allowed Thomas to marry Catherine Parr, Henry's widow. The couple had been close in 1543 and would likely have married had the king not taken an interest in Catherine himself. Catherine was not Thomas's first choice. He was more interested in Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. However, Henry's will stipulated that only the Privy Council could decide on the marriages of these women. Theoretically, Edward could have rescinded this instruction, but the 9-year-old did not want to. Those who claim his uncle controlled him overlooked this fact. Edward was willing to allow Thomas to marry Catherine Parr. The couple married secretly in April 1547, just over 2 months after Henry's death. The relationship between Edward and his stepmother suffered because Edward felt it was too soon. When Catherine died in childbirth in September 1548, Thomas attempted again to marry Mary or Elizabeth, but Edward rejected the request once more. During these years, Thomas tried emphatically to become his nephew's favourite uncle. He repeatedly told the young king that he should rule himself and choose his own advisors. Edward later reported these conversations candidly, indicating that he and his uncle did not have a truly trusting relationship. Edward appreciated the money and gifts he received and likely enjoyed the flattery, but he did not allow himself to be swayed. Thomas Seymour became another in a long list of people who underestimated Edward, viewing him as a child, and paid dearly for it. However, this conflict was not yet at its peak. After Catherine Parr's death, Thomas became one of the richest men in the country as her heir, but several scandals loomed, including one involving the king's half-sister, Elizabeth. Moreover, Thomas approached various nobles, promising them posts if they supported him against his brother. He repeatedly smuggled his own men into Parliament and openly threatened to disrupt meetings in the autumn of 1547. By 1548, Thomas's actions had turned criminal. Tasked with hunting pirates, he instead sought alliances with some of them. He secured a strategically important river, crossing with his own men, commissioned the sub-treasurer of the Bristol Mint to mint money for him, and stocked his castle in Holt with enough supplies to withstand a long siege. Whatever he had planned for the young king in January 1549, Thomas had likely devised it well in advance, and it was not benign at all. This takes us back to the fateful night of January 16th. Thomas Seymour had reached the door of his nephew's apartments. The king's favourite dog, a spaniel, slept nearby. Seymour's presence woke the animal, causing it to bark. In a panic, Seymour grabbed his gun, pulled the trigger, and killed the dog. The king's chamberlains and the monarch were awakened by the shot. One of them shouted, "Help! Murder!" Seymour fled before a guard could arrive. However, he was quickly caught, especially since some guards revealed they had been assigned tasks in Seymour's name, which prevented them from completing their usual patrols. Then, the unbelievable happened. While the king was still weeping over the dead body of his pet, the guards let Seymour go. Thomas stammered an excuse that he just wanted to test how well his nephew was protected. This explanation apparently satisfied the guards. Feeling secure with their decision, Seymour went home instead of fleeing. This complacency would soon take its toll. That night, members of the Privy Council were awakened and gathered at Hampton Court, except Thomas. According to official records, there were several conferences of the council. Ultimately, the members present unanimously decided to arrest Thomas and place him in the Tower of London. At first, Seymour resisted, but had to comply as some of his servants and confidants were taken away. He realised he had no choice. The Lord Privy Seal, John Russell, was tasked with directing the investigation. Russell was not only one of Thomas's predecessors as High Admiral of England, but also one of Edward's favourites. Russell had served Henry VII and Henry VIII reliably, and had never raised doubts about his loyalty despite difficult times. He was, therefore, the ideal man for the investigation. The Privy Council made no secret of the events that transpired. An embassy report noted that the council members spoke very frankly about the situation. Then, a political bombshell hit London. Thomas Parry, accountant of Elizabeth's household, and Cat Ashley, governess of the King's half-sister, were arrested and sent to the Tower. This reportedly occurred after a heated argument between Russell and Thomas in the Tower. What the two household members revealed shook the government, prompting Elizabeth to be summoned as well. After her father's death, Elizabeth rejected Mary's offer to live with her and instead moved in with Thomas Seymour and Catherine Parr. Edward's uncles soon took an inappropriate interest in Elizabeth. He frequently visited Elizabeth's bedroom in the morning, patting her back and buttocks in a familiar way. He often pretended to pounce on her and kiss her while she was still in bed. Sometimes he appeared with bare legs, which Ashley found outrageous. Thomas responded, "I will tell the Lord Protector how I am being slandered. By God's precious soul, I mean no evil, and I will not leave it." Catherine Parr allegedly participated in this behavior. She reportedly joined in teasing Elizabeth in the mornings and once held her stepdaughter so Thomas could cut her dress. 15-year-old Elizabeth seemed to return some of the older man's affection. In May 1548, Catherine found her stepdaughter and husband embracing. When Catherine arrived, they had been alone together. The pregnant Queen Dowager demanded Elizabeth leave her household immediately. Elizabeth protested her innocence, still holding Thomas's arm, but to no avail. Elizabeth left a few days later. Thomas and Catherine moved from Chelsea to Sudeley Castle in June, accompanied by Lady Jane Grey. Jane's father, Henry Grey, was one of the people Thomas courted to eliminate his brother. After Catherine's death, Thomas again tried to involve himself with Elizabeth. This time, Ashley had no objections. Members of the Privy Council reported that Thomas wanted to kidnap Edward to force him to agree to his marriage to Elizabeth. Others suggested Seymour intended to marry Elizabeth, then kill Edward, his half-sister Mary, and his brother to become king himself. A letter from the imperial ambassador to the emperor mentioned a terrifying name for political England. Thomas wanted to follow the example of Richard III. This would have made Edward VI the new Edward IV. The letter also claimed that 400 young lords supported Seymour. While this figure is impossible to verify, it highlights the concern over the conspiracy's potential support. Parry's statements were particularly credible. He not only proved that Thomas had questioned him about Elizabeth's fortune early on, but also noted that he was the grandson of Thomas Vaughan, a member of Edward V's entourage whom Richard III had murdered. Elizabeth cleverly avoided becoming the focus of the interrogations. She had her interrogation specialist, Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, confirm that Thomas was a member of the Privy Council. She asked why she should assume the Privy Council was unaware of a member's conversations with her, conversations that, according to her father's will, also concerned the Privy Council. This argument was convincing. What the investigators uncovered was devastating and went far beyond mere betrayal. Loot from pirates was found in Thomas Seymour's household. The Privy Council compiled a total of 31 charges against him. Edward Seymour presented these charges to the king, arguing that his duty to his monarch outweighed the brotherly love he felt for Thomas. After this formality, the case was handed over to Parliament. Acting as a court, Parliament heard the case. Thomas did not have the right to speak directly before a judge, but was confronted several times with witness testimonies in February 1549. Sir William Paget, a member of the Privy Council, remarked that Thomas's greed had clearly exceeded his intellect and judgment. Edward Seymour was present at all the parliamentary sessions concerning his brother, but remained silent. This was not just a public role. In early March 1549, Parliament found Thomas guilty by Bill of Attainder and issued the corresponding document to the Privy Council. Normally, the monarch would now issue a death warrant specifying the details of the execution and sign the document to make it legally binding. However, in this case, there was a minority. As Lord Protector, Edward Seymour was responsible for this task, but did not feel capable of performing it.
Before I reveal what happens next, a really short advertising block. I have put together a source sheet on this topic for my members, which is now available. I also wanted to briefly thank everyone who's considering a membership or a super thanks. The money goes into books for new videos and some cat treats. Back to the show.
What happened next was unusual. The council did not know how to proceed. The 11-year-old king had to save the committee from its predicament. The council sought out the monarch and asked him for instructions. Edward's response is recorded in the council book, with a clear indication that these were the king's spontaneous words, spoken freely and of his own accord. We perceive that there are great things objected and laid to my Lord High Admiral, my uncle, and they tend to treason. And we perceive that you require but justice to be done. We think reasonable that you proceed according to your request. In other words, Edward ordered that the execution of his uncle be carried out. This is why the death warrant bears all the signatures of the council, as the king mandated the entire council. People who have seen the original describe Edward Seymour's signature as shaking. He was apparently still struggling. However, he no longer had to send his brother to his death himself, but was following an order from the king. Edward did not forget that this task was imposed on him. His relationship with the Lord Protector, already problematic, cooled significantly. This is also one of the reasons why I do not believe the king was privy to the plan, as is sometimes claimed. There would have been much easier options than this. Thomas Seymour's life ended on March 20th, 1549. The king simply noted, also the Lord Sudeley, Admiral of England, was condemned to death and died the March ensuing. One final drama remained unclear. Thomas had messages sewn into his shoes for Mary and Elizabeth, imploring them to take action against his brother. His servants were to deliver the messages after his execution, but this plan was exposed. Karma then overtook Seymour. It took a second blow with the axe to separate his head from his body. Thomas is said to have written this poem in the Tower while awaiting his execution. Forgetting God to love a king, hath been my rod, or else nothing. In this frail life, being a blast of care and strife, till in be past. Yet God did call me in my pride, ret I should fall, and from him slide, for whom loves he, and not correct, that they may be of his elect. The death haste thee, thou shalt me gain immortally with him, to reign who send the king. Like years as noy, in governing his realm enjoy, and after this frail life, such grace, as in his bliss, he may have place. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to support the channel.